If this graph doesn't represent the shifting world order, then I don't know what does. According to this Statista chart, the BRICS countries are snatching a larger share of the world's GDP, and this chasm will only get bigger as time goes on. Things got even more controversial during the 15th BRICS summit in August 2023, but more on that later. If we go back to the chart, we can see that sometime after 2020, when both BRICS and G7 each shared 31% of the world's GDP, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa's share of the global GDP began to increase. The BRICS share of international GDP has kept growing. Since this is a zero-sum game, the GDP of the G7 countries continued the downward trend they've been on since the year 2000. Now, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, why is that? Well, there are several factors at play here. G7 countries, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States have a population of 800 million. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, on the other hand, have a population of 3.27 billion, which is 4 times higher than that of the G7. And yet, despite giant population differences, the GDP of each country by purchasing power parity, which is considered the true GDP of a country, is only slightly higher for the BRICS countries than it is for the G7 nations, $42.4 trillion compared to $42.1 trillion. Logically, it's easy to conclude that the per capita GDP is 4 times higher in G7 countries than it is in BRICS countries. For example, if someone has a GDP of $1,000 in Russia, that same average person would have a $4,000 GDP in the USA. That being said, the large population could be considered a double-edged sword. Sure, the situation looks more favorable for people living in the G7 countries at the moment, but what if we extend the time frame? How would this affect the BRICS countries in 20 to 30 years? You see, from the 1990s until 2022, the G7 countries' GDP grew by 1.5% per year on average. In that same period, the BRICS countries grew their GDP by an average of 4.5% annually. And for individual countries, these numbers are even greater. For example, China's average growth over that period equaled 12.3%, while India increased its GDP by 6.4% per year. The only countries that were on par with the growth of G7 nations were Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, which averaged around 1.3% annual GDP growth. If we decide to compare the BRICS countries to the G7 countries, then there are 3 metrics where G7 stands head and shoulders above BRICS. The first is the Liberal Democracy Index, provided by the Institute of Democracy, which ranks 180 countries on an index from 0 to 1. And while the G7 countries hover between the 0.7 and 0.8 mark, the BRICS countries quickly descend to the bottom 0.1, with Russia and India having the lowest scores, and South Africa the highest, with 5.8. For the second metric, civil liberties and political rights, according to Freedom House, these things are basically non-existent in the BRICS countries. And again, Russia and China found themselves at the bottom. Of the G7 member countries, Canada had the highest score, closest to 100, while the USA had the lowest, hovering around the same mark as South Africa. And the third metric that I'd like to point out right now is the Corruption Perception Index, provided by Transparency International. G7 countries range from Italy, 56 on the low end, to Germany, 79 on the high end. Meanwhile, the highest CPI for the BRICS countries starts at 45 for China and goes down to around 29 for Russia. The fourth metric that seems to follow the same trend is the Rule of Law Index provided by the World Justice Project, where G7 nations clearly outrank Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But what if I told you that things are going to be changing in the near future? While many geopolitical experts have argued that BRICS members have very little in common with each other, besides a dislike for US clout, this lack of hegemony between the nations will pose a serious problem for BRICS. And even though they account for around 42% of the global population, how they cooperate and allocate resources. The G7 nations, on the other hand, are very similar. they could all be classified as wealthy liberal democracies who take serious responsibility for the world economy. However, while some from the West would like to point fingers at the lack of unity inside BRICS, saying that the countries don't even vote in each other's favor in the UN, however, the reality is very different. For example, according to an article published on Reuters, India began buying Russian gas and was cooperating on payment networks to bypass American sanctions imposed on Russia. During this time, India's imports from Russia increased nearly fivefold from April 2022 to February 2023, from $8.54 billion to $41.56 billion. Second, regarding the so-called lack of hegemony among BRICS countries isn't entirely true. The nations of the BRICS bloc aren't that different from one another. For example, we know that Russia and China share a history of socialist regimes, but India isn't too far off. Socialism was one of the foundation blocks for the post-independence government organization of India. Many Indian people can still remember reading Russian literature translated into Indian Bangla. In fact, India and China were part of the 32 nations that abstained from the UN vote for the Russian question in 2023. Third, China is lending money to many of the BRICS countries, especially India. For example, they're funding the new subway in Dhaka, Bangladesh. With their Belt and Road Initiative, China has allocated funds to several major infrastructure projects in South Africa. For example, they're funding the Durban Port Facility expansion. They're building a coal-fired power plant, and in Limpopo, they're establishing the Musina Makado Special Economic Zone. These are only part of the projects funded by China from 2000 until 2019. The total scope of the investment equals something like $153 billion. As you can see, it would be a mistake for G7 to dismiss BRICS, saying they have little impact on US foreign policy, especially since 22 countries showed interest in joining the alliance. When you have a waiting list of countries that are trying to join your alliance, it's not wise to dismiss the alliance's importance, especially since most of the countries that are seeking membership aren't necessarily keen on being bullied by Washington to fall in line with US policies. That being said, BRICS made international headlines earlier in 2023 when they announced that 6 new countries will be joining their alliance, changing the acronym to BRICS+. Since its founding in 2009, BRICS has managed out of the spotlight, but all that changed in 2023. During the 15th summit in August 2023, the BRICS countries decided to expand their member states, and in January 2024, BRICS+ was born, with the addition of 6 new member states. After the inclusion of Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia, BRICS+ 32% share of the world's GDP jumped to 36% in a matter of days. And with that, the chasm between the member states grew even more. Before the expansion, BRICS had a cumulative GDP of $27.7 trillion. With the addition of $3.1 trillion in GDP with their 6 new allies, BRICS+ laps the G7 member states. So what does this expansion mean for the EU and the Western world? First off, the BRICS countries account for almost half of the world's population, or 46%. That's almost 5 times larger than G7's 10% of the global population. And this is where things begin to get serious, because these are growing economies and their population is much larger. Their growth potential is bigger than expected. Even though China accounts for 52% of the group's GDP at purchasing power parity and 86% of the global production of heavy rare earth elements in 2021, the other member states are only expected to grow. For example, BRICS+ countries were responsible for 25% of the global exports in 2021. But these new members bring much more than just raw GDP. For example, with the addition of Saudi Arabia to BRICS+, the bloc's share of oil production nearly doubled to about 43%. Argentina, on the other hand, increased the group's lithium reserves. As the world moves to electric vehicles and eVTOL aircraft, batteries, and therefore lithium become significantly important. This seems to be an underlying trend for BRICS+. The bloc is acquiring nations that are rich in natural resources while building a trading system that's independent of the US dollar. Discussions about replacing the US dollar as the world's reserve currency took place during the 15th BRICS Summit in 2023, which only accentuated the group's expansionist tendencies. The 6 new entrants might not contribute a lot in terms of GDP, but they do contribute a lot in terms of growth potential. According to Goldman Sachs, the average GDP growth of the BRICS+ members is estimated at 189% by 2050, while their competitor, G7, is expected to grow by a modest 50% in the next 25 years. Ethiopia's GDP, for example, is expected to grow by 1,170% by 2050, while the GDP of Egypt is expected to expand by 635% by 2025. In other words, the BRICS+ long-term plan is focused on future GDP growth and intrinsic value, not just sheer purchasing power. Speaking of which, while the GDP of the G7 countries was set at $45.9 trillion, with the US contributing $26.9 trillion, their GDP in terms of purchasing power parity is much lower. In other words, the GDP of BRICS+ nations might equal $30.8 trillion, but their purchasing power parity GDP is roughly the same since the standard of living in these countries is much lower. The International Monetary Fund predicts that by 2027, 3 years in the future, the BRICS+ countries will account for 37.6% of the world GDP at PPP, while G7's GDP will dwindle to only 28.2%. As BRICS adopted the Johannesburg Declaration II in 2023, the bloc is adopting inclusive economic policies that will help the development of new members. And since we're on the subject of new members, in 2022, BRICS received applications from 22 countries from across the globe. However, since BRICS+ is focusing on structured and planned growth, the majority of these applications were declined, according to Anil Sukla. And this concludes the video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to leave a like. It would be greatly appreciated. Goodbye for now.